Good evening. Good evening. I'm Persis Drell. I'm the provost of Stanford University, and it is my very great pleasure to welcome you to the 53rd Carlos Kelly McClatchy Symposium. We are very fortunate to have both Susan McClatchy and Will McClatchy here tonight, and so I would like to thank them for all that the McClatchy family has done to support the study of journalism here at Stanford. Now, I think this is a particularly important time for us to reflect on the role of journalism in our society. I think we can probably all agree that a free and independent press remains critical to our democracy. In its mission to seek out and present the truth, the press holds the powerful accountable and helps us engage as citizens. No other institution has the power to question our leaders, expose corruption, and inspire social change by analyzing and providing context for local, national, and global events. Our free press educates and empowers us. Now, in recent years, we've seen many transformational changes in the news media, along with major shifts in the ways we consume news, including the rise of digital media, social media, and cable news, media companies that are decreasing or eliminating resources for local news and thereby creating news deserts, the decline of newspapers and, because of it, fewer reporters charged with keeping an eye on those in power, an increase in the spread of misinformation and the ability to screen out news that doesn't adhere to our political or personal ideology. And perhaps most importantly, the erosion of public trust in the media and, worse, increased hostility towards the press in our own country and around the world. Tackling these challenges is the goal of the newly formed Stanford Journalism and Democracy Initiative, which has brought together our journalism program, the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships, and the Brown Institute for Media Innovation. Under the leadership of Jay Hamilton, the director of the Stanford Journalism Program and chair of our Department of Communications, this initiative is dedicated to helping journalists make better use of data and algorithms, fight against misinformation, eradicate news deserts, and root out bias and intolerance. Stanford scholars in economics, law, political science, computer science, and business are collaborating with journalists to address these issues and to help understand the workings of our political system. Now, tonight, we're going to have the great pleasure of hearing from somebody who is uniquely qualified to talk about today's challenges in journalism and the workings of our political system, Bob Woodward. After 47 years at the Washington Post, covering 9 presidents, he is a true expert in understanding how institutions in Washington work. In his first 9 months as a reporter at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward had more front-page stories than any of the other 60 journalists on the Metro reporting staff. He started out by conducting a series of local investigations on topics like outdated and mislabeled prescriptions dispensed by drugstores, health law violations in expensive restaurants, doctors profiteering from Medicaid, and corruption in the police department's elite unit that was investigating the honesty of the rest of the force. His reporting brought the Washington Post 2 Pulitzer Prizes, first in 1973 for the coverage of the Watergate scandal with Carl Bernstein, and second in 2003 as the lead reporter for the coverage of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. He is the author or co-author of 19 books, including his most recent bestseller, Fear, which is a fascinating look inside the current presidency. and I hope we'll be hearing more about that tonight. He will be interviewed tonight by R.B. Brenner, a former Metro editor and Sunday editor of the Washington Post, who guided the newspaper's Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of the Virginia Tech shootings. R.B. is a lecturer in the Department of Communications and the managing director of the Stanford Journalism and Democracy Initiative. So please join me in welcoming R.B. Brenner and Bob Woodward for this year's McClatchy Symposium.
Thank you, Provost Drell. Hello to all of you and to those watching on the video stream from other locations. And Bob, welcome to Stanford.
Thank you.
So let's jump right in. In the past 48 hours, you had Democrats winning back control of the House. You had Jeff Sessions being forced out as Attorney General. Matthew Whitaker, a critic of the Mueller investigation, is now in charge of it. And the president, at a news conference yesterday, said he'd work with Democrats, but if they try to investigate him, he will go on a, quote, warlike footing. I'm not going to ask you to predict the future, but from your reporter's eyes, what will you be looking for in the coming months?
Well, see, I think this is part of the problem with our business. You are asking questions like a talk show host. What happened today or this week? And the problem is we don't know the answers to those questions in terms of what really happened or what drove the president. The warlike stance, I think, is not new. I think it's been going on, obviously, for a long time. And so we've got to think about how we, and I've tried to do this in the book on Trump, go back and look at what we ran by covering on a daily basis or a weekly basis. What drove him? What happened? And because I have the luxury of time to work on this, it can tell you some things that you didn't know. And to just review the bidding real quickly of that reporting effort, that you had people in the White House, Chief Economic Advisor Gary Cohn, the staff secretary, other people stealing documents from the president's desk, worrying that he actually will sign them and take some of his impulses and translate that to policy. You have top secret national security meetings in which the president laments, as he still does today in rallies, saying, why are we spending all this money on our joint defense agreements, NATO and Europe, or in South Korea, or in the Middle East? And it reaches a point where it really stunned me that the Secretary of Defense had to tell the president, and this is what the first year after Trump had been in the office a year, said we're doing all of these things to prevent World War III. That's job one of the president. He shouldn't have to be told. And so there is enough new, and I think the new really summary shows we have a governing crisis, that this is, I call it in the book, a nervous breakdown of the system, but in all of the substantive areas, Trump has decided to do things based on ideas he has that are not valid, on various impulses, and we better wake up that this is really a governing crisis, and we're going to suffer if we don't figure out how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Let me jump back to the one pushback I would say to this is the removal of Sessions and the fact that the governing crisis also could be the future of the Mueller investigation.
Yes, it could, but we know, and I report in the book, that Sessions was out, but just not officially,
Right.
and Trump actually mocked him and said things about him that he is mentally ill, and in public we knew this was going. And the Mueller investigation is a question mark. I think it's a very serious, important investigation. As I worked on this, I didn't find anything new or dramatic. That in the last page of the book, Trump and his lawyer, John Dowd, actually go through and think Mueller has something they don't know about. I think that's quite possible, and that may change the whole context, but we don't know.
So the story you brought up in the book about the letter that was essentially the letter to try to pull the United States out of NAFTA, and Cohn said, take it off the desk. In a more large sense, is that an example of, we have a government right now where unelected officials are making decisions of when to follow the president's wishes, when to slow walk them, in some cases when to defy them. In your mind, is that patriotism or insubordination?
Happily, I don't have to make a judgment on that. I get to just describe what happened. But imagine going home and your spouse saying, how was everything at the office today? And say, well, I just lifted papers from the president's desk in the Oval Office because I am afraid he might actually implement some of these dangerous policies. So I think in many ways you can argue it's not the way to run a government, but you know, that's Trump's fault. He denied that a document had been removed from the Resolute desk, as I described, and just anticipating that denial, I print a copy of the document. If you wanted, I would have brought the original here to show you that it's, when Trump reads that, or, you know, he should say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here? Is this the way to run the government? I think people who do things like that look at it from their point of view as an act of conscience and courage, and I think you can argue. Sometimes you have to say no to the president, and if he finds out or doesn't like it, he can fire you.
So I want to hit on Mueller a bit. How well do you know him, and what's he like?
I don't know him well enough. It's interesting. Some time ago, I was talking to somebody who worked very closely with him in the intelligence business, and I asked that question, and he said, well, Mueller is the sort of prosecutor that if he finds out you ripped the mattress tag off, he will prosecute. And people used to jokingly call him Bobby the mattress tag prosecutor. So he tends to take the violations literally. You remember as a child seeing that tag on the mattress?
Yes.
I remember, I think I was in 4th grade, and I looked at that and I said, my God, just like that, and I go to jail? Very scary. I also first talked to him after he became FBI director after 9/11, and he said some things about how he babbled at a meeting at Camp David after 9/11, didn't put it in the newspaper, but I did put it in the first Bush book I did, and ran into him at a reception. And he said, I see you got the babbling in. And I thought, that's interesting. He's reading his press clippings somewhat more carefully than you might think. So he's, where that goes, I don't know. What I do know from Watergate, you need to if a president's going to resign or be removed in any way, you need clarity of evidence, like the tapes in the Nixon case. And in the Nixon case, there was closure because the evidence was so powerful. And all the Republicans turned against Nixon, essentially, forcing his resignation. And I don't see that we had tapes. I don't know whether there's prosecutors will tell you you need a narrator, one person who can kind of tell you the story, a storytelling witness. And I don't see that, but maybe it's there. I think you can really say that Trump, I make this point in the book, that he doesn't have a to-do list. The reason they can steal documents off his desk, he doesn't remember that they were there. And he doesn't have these are the things we need to deal with. And so that's a governing problem. All of these things are governing problems, I think.
And we were talking a little earlier this evening, and you talked about Nixon, if he had just sort of said what Trump says, it's a hoax, and not really turn over and cooperate in certain things, it might have had a very different fate in Watergate.
Nixon, after he fired the first Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox, made two serious miscalculations. He turned over 8 of the tapes that had been subpoenaed, including one of them that was the most incriminating. And he thought the problem was the first special prosecutor because he was an effing Harvard law professor. And he then said, okay, I've got rid of Cox, so he appointed somebody else, Leon Jaworski, and then Jaworski saw, if you get into this, what happened, saw that first tape that was really incriminating about Nixon okaying the 12 times in one meeting the payment of blackmail money to people for their silence. Jaworski then led the charge against Nixon.
I've heard you say a lot that specifics are the building block of journalism, and the power of your book is the specific scenes and the specific details. But a book, like any piece of good journalism, also has overarching themes. You talked about the crisis of governing. What, in your mind, are the other big themes of this book?
That whether I try to come at this from a nonpartisan angle, and I've been called a leftist. I've been called a member of the right-wing conspiracy, but thank God last year somebody called me an ultra-centrist. Whatever that means, maybe.
There might be the only one now.
Yes, that's right. And what it shows is we better wake up that I could sit here and bore you and list all of the major policy areas in foreign policy with North Korea or with Afghanistan or in the Middle East. I mean, look at the gamble. Each one of these things is a gamble. The tax cut is a gamble, and Trump sells this as a great achievement. If you look at the tax cut, they cut corporate taxes from 35 to 21%. Trump wanted to go lower to 15, and they said, no, we can't get that. It is a tax bill that helps businesses, corporations, and people who are wealthy. But it's a classic economic stimulus that will boost the economy. We are experiencing the boost. Trump was selling it, still is selling it. But if you look at some of the numbers, they will make your stomach hurt because economic activity is going down, the trade war with China, the business with Mexico and Canada in the new NAFTA. Anyway, all of these things, if you pull them apart, you realize you better be deeply worried. The problem in the media culture is that impatience and speed, and Trump leads everyone around. I mean, everyone's taking the bait, and we cover his tweets as if that is major news. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, but we've lost our capacity to really dig and understand the details on lots of these things, and
So-
God is in the details.
So the Washington Post, our paper, has certainly put a lot of reporting resources on this administration compared to any other one. But do you feel like it's not just numbers, it's sort of the way you do it? And is there still a failure of the press to cover this president?
It's not a failure. It's that you've got to do a lot more digging and have a lot more patience. I was talking to the head of one of the television networks on the news side. It said, how many people do you have covering Trump and the White House? I said about 50. That's a big number. How many are doing long-term digging projects? Said maybe 4 or 5. That's not enough. That we need to know. I mean, look at, look at what happened in the deal with Saudi Arabia. They forgot to read what's in the CIA files about the Saudis like to kill people, and they killed Jamal Khashoggi, who used to write for the Washington Post. I mean, that is people say it's grisly, but it is a policy failure to not incorporate that knowledge. And I have in the book the intelligence agencies, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Advisor saying, don't make this deal with the Saudis now. And it is Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law, who at the meeting stands up at the end of the table and says, yes, I understand all of this, but this is an opportunity. And by March of last year, President Trump had not been president 2 months. They agreed on this arrangement and started to go down that trail. I know because I've worked on this and the CIA, the ruthlessness of the Saudis is not a secret. It's not a secret, particularly to the CIA. Anyway, you can go pick China, the trade war there, all of the issues going on with immigration and so forth that are substantive. And I'm just saying, factually, it's a crisis. It's a governing crisis. Don't overlook it and don't drown in Trump's really astonishing ability to seize the news cycle.
Let's talk a little bit about General Mattis. We had corresponded a little bit, and you had mentioned that Mattis is a big fan of Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, about how World War I was an accidental war. Does Mattis worry about that now?
Yes, he does, because you can, the generals know the horror of war. The problem from covering 9 presidents, not all the presidents fully understand the nightmare that war is, and that they should try to avoid war at all costs. Now, sometimes you have to go to war if you're attacked. And General Mattis, Barbara Tuchman's book, Guns of August, is a brilliant excavation of how we got into World War I, and everyone was planning for it. No one actually decided, and then somebody lit the fuse. The assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo started that. And I'm sorry to linger on this, but this is the world we're living in. Barbara Tuchman begins her book in 1910, so 4 years before World War I starts. And it is the funeral of Edward VII, I believe, of England, and at his funeral are 9 kings, 4 queens, all kinds of representatives of royalty, and she says, the funeral began at 9, Big Ben struck 9, and then she writes, but on history's clock, the sun was setting on the old order of kings and royalty. I think right now, a century plus, the old order, the sun set on it, and the political parties, Republicans, Democrats, didn't find a way to reorient themselves to what's really going on in the country, and that Trump alone seized history's clock. And I don't think we understand it. I certainly don't understand it, but he's done it. And it's not just history's clock, it's the presidency, and you can tell. I'm worried about it, and I think everyone should worry about it. And I think, this is not anything personal or partisan, it is just look at what the gambling that's going on with all of these policies, and the price will have to be paid someday.
Mm-hmm. And going back to the Kushner in Saudi Arabia, and then obviously Trump and Putin, there's certainly the perception that things might be driven not by policy and what's the best interest of the United States and our government, but also there's entanglements from someone who was not in government who's had financial dealings with Saudi Arabia, with Russia. How should we be looking at that?
Yeah, and the answer just is not clear. And Trump and Putin, I mean, there obviously is some sort of romance there, but if you get into the policy, Trump has been very tough on Russia and Putin. And this April, when chemical weapons were used in Syria by President Assad, Trump went on television and gave a speech excoriating Putin as the one behind this, as the one who has made the mistake, and there's certain sanctions being imposed on Russia. So I think Russia is more of a mixed bag. It's some of these areas like China. China's very smart in a tariff war. Trump has said, oh, we can win a tariff war. Somebody who knows said, when it comes to tariff wars, the Chinese have a PhD, and we are in kindergarten. And there is a lot going on in that tariff war that has not surfaced, and there are a lot of people who grow and sell soybeans, for instance, who are very unhappy and losing lots of money.
I also wanted to double back a little on this issue of, you talked about not enough reporting resources going really deep, but I'm also seeing examples, and I'll cite 2, of really deep reporting that just seems like would have 5-10 years ago had that lasting impact. And I'm thinking of the New York Times investigation of essentially how the president became wealthy. And that was, I think, 18 months or 2 years of really good investigative reporting. It sort of was in the news cycle about 24 hours, and it was gone. And even your book, I think, certainly made an enormous impact, but it just seems like the way we're processing information is just this warp speed, and that's a factor here.
Yes, but the tax issue with Trump, that was a wonderful article about what happens in the New York real estate business. And I remember after it came out talking to somebody in the New York real estate business who said, oh yeah, that's what we all do. And I think that's quite true.
But the difference is, at least for a certain percentage of Trump voters, it was this sense of this is this very successful businessman who's going to take the success of his business career and bring it to government, and that sort of exposed that that maybe is not the case.
Well, maybe we all should have gone into the New York real estate business. But that's more of a real estate story than a Trump story, quite frankly. And yes, my book, I walk down the street sometimes and people will come up and say, when is he resigning? And people have lost sight of the time frame. And in Watergate, we did the stories in '72, and it was almost 2 years before Nixon resigned, and there were a series of incidents, particularly the disclosure of the tapes and it going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court unanimously saying you have to turn over the tapes. So we somehow have to get out of the frame of let's say where all this is going and get into the frame of let's find out what's really happening on these things. And the modern presidency, I think, has become it's crisis management, and presidents don't have the time or the inclination to think strategically. Where do we want to go? It's how do we manage that daily crisis? And we're not getting to a point where we figure out, my God, what's the next stage of good for a majority of people in the country? And that's the president's job, and it's just not happening.
Given the crisis you talked about, but you also said earlier that you've tried very hard to not be seen as a partisan. You're a journalist. But there have been times in appearances where you've probably come close to being perceived as anti-Trump. Yeah. Sort of how have you tried to navigate maybe a line that you never thought you'd get this close to in your career?
It's a good question, and lots of people said to me, you're going to become a combatant in this because of the information, but it is, I have not got a lot of hate mail. I have not received a lot of love mail either. But but you're exactly right. It's everything is seen through a partisan lens. The country clearly is divided in a way that I've never seen, no one has really ever seen before. And so, is this good for Trump or is this bad for Trump? And I think that's not the question. The question is it good for the country? Is it that next stage of good for enough people? And I don't think Trump, either in terms of his personality or his managerial skills, has found a way to navigate to that. In a time when we don't have a new war, when the economy, at least superficially, is going, he should be able to navigate there.
So I want to talk a little bit about deep background reporting. I know when the subject of anonymous sources comes up, you say they're not anonymous to you, which is certainly true, but I think the public often doesn't understand first what a deep background source is and why they're so valuable to reporting. So
what do you think of deep background sources?
Well, a deep background source from the Washington Post culture is that I can use the information, but I don't say where it's coming from. If it's a background source, I say a senior administration official. Right,
but I think the value of deep background is when you're working on a long book project, somebody can say, oh, there's a meeting about the following at the Pentagon, and it was kind of contentious. Then you can find people who were there, get somebody who has notes, review it with others, and you're not naming any of the sources, but you're telling what really happened, and it has a kind of verisimilitude that, oh yeah, that is right and seems true, and in fact, it is true, but you don't get there in an afternoon or a week of reporting. You only get there in a year or more of reporting and people who find those documents.
So drilling down that a little bit, so obviously without revealing the sources, but I'll talk about if people were on the record, Gary Cohn, Steve Bannon, Rob Porter, when we're reading this is from that person, we're at least able to assess, oh, that person was fired, that person was rival of this person. So when you do this very complex, deep background reporting, how do you make sure that you're taking into account all of the various agendas and the knives that are out, because we're trusting in you because we as the reader can't do that.
Yes, but I can do it, and when it says at 5:15 on July 18th, Tuesday, they had this meeting in the Chief of Staff's office, and these were the people, and this is the dialogue. It has the notes from people who are quoted, who have been asked or don't dispute what's in there. And it's all about time against the problem for me. And is somebody going to accept that? That's much better than going to all those people and saying, now on the record, the press has kind of become, on the record relieves you as a reporter from the responsibility of reporting untruth. And you go to the White House and you say, Chief of Staff Kelly, did you call the president an idiot? Did you, say all of these things? Others have said, oh, no, absolutely not. Or he won't talk to you. I just think we've got to accept the responsibility of saying, yes, it's on my head, my back, that these sources have been cross-checked, and there is so much reporting behind it that gives it a kind of authenticity. And I think people understand that. I would love everyone to say, okay, now you can identify all of the sources. Some of the best information, most important information in the book came from 3 sources who were not named in the book at all. And probably people, I can say with certainty, that you'd never heard of. Mm-hmm. But there are people in government, backbenchers, people who are in offices, people who keep diaries and so forth, that can bolster this.
I'm going to throw in one question here from a faculty member who had given me this earlier because it relates. And the question is, I'm reading exactly. It says, since the Janet Cooke scandal in 1981, many newsrooms began to insist that reporters share with at least one senior editor the identity of unnamed sources. Is there an editor at Simon & Schuster who knows the identity of your sources?
Okay. The Janet Cooke scandal, I was the Metro editor, young reporter, who did a story about an 8-year-old heroin addict whose mother and boyfriend were making allegedly this 8-year-old a heroin addict, and it turned out to be fabricated. And she won a Pulitzer Prize for the story, and it was a deep embarrassment and fault on my part to not push that. And in the case of who the sources are, happily, I went over some of them with people and lawyers at Simon & Schuster, my publisher, and my wife, Elsa Walsh, knows all the sources. And she was, and if the source wasn't good, she would say, get your ass in the den and call people or go see people, and she was very tough. And she read the book 6 times, edited it 6 times, and most importantly, and I tell this is very personal, but she realized this was our joint kind of family project, and I was able to work pretty much full-time on this. I think there was 50 days I worked every day and every night, and she not once dropped the penalty flag on me, saying, you know, I thought we were married, or I thought we should go to dinner or do something, and everything was focused on the book, and she is secure enough. She was happy to have me go off and see somebody and knock on some door without an appointment, because she could read or do other things. But never once did she say to me, it was always work harder at this, because she felt that it was of consequence, and that she read transcripts and listened to tapes and so forth. And so that is for anybody in any job, it's more than a blessing. It's if you don't have that kind of, there are penalty flags being dropped all over the house, it's very difficult to proceed with something like this.
So a two-parter here. You did 4 books on George W. Bush's administration. You did books on Obama, presidents going back to Nixon, obviously. This administration seems, and this president, so unconventional, but was your approach to doing this book much different than these other books?
I discovered that I'd become lazy. And I was having people over for dinner or lunch, and I wasn't I learned this from Carl Bernstein in Watergate. When we started working on Watergate, I'd been a reporter at a weekly newspaper for a year and at the Post 9 months. Carl actually was a reporter since birth. Since age 16, he worked as a copy boy at the Star. And Carl's was and still is a renegade. And in Watergate, he said, we're going to only get BS if we go see people in the White House. They probably won't let us in. Go see people at the committee to re-elect the president. We're going to have to go knock on doors at night and win people's trust. And I found in working on this book, I was not doing that. And we all have fork in the road moments when, you know, you're going to go this way or that way. And it was 11 o'clock at night. I had the number for somebody at the White House, and I thought 11 o'clock at night, you know, at this last year I was 74 years old. I said, you know, you idiot, go to bed. And for only the reason I had the phone number, frankly, I called and said, I wanted to talk to you, and he answered, and I said, and he said, oh, yeah, you know, the brush off, ever get the brush off? And I said, well, he said, call the office tomorrow. We'll get together. And I said, well, how about now, 11 o'clock? And then he called me a dirty name and said, you know, why 11 o'clock at night? And I literally said, I'm 4 minutes from your house. And he said, how do you know where I live? I said, I have good research assistants, and that's not hard. And he said, okay, come on by for luck. He was, his wife was out of town. And so we started talking, and it was almost dawn when I left. And subsequent interviews, I said, how about documents? No, I don't have any documents. Just a few things, no. And then finally, well, yeah, maybe I have something up in the attic. And he goes, and he comes down. with boxes. So, I was giving up too easily. And it was a real discovery about the process of winning people's trust. And I also found, in terms of process, not taking information off the record means you can't use it. And I said, no, you've got to give me information I can use. I won't say where it came from, and people would acquiesce to that. I think there are a group of reporters in Washington, it's an elite club. People know all these things off the record, and they're not telling their readers or their viewers. When the book came out and somebody denied something, one of the great reporters in Washington called me and said, I have hives because I've heard that person say exactly that thing off the record. And so we're sealing up a reality that I don't think we should let be sealed up. And that means just you've got to go back and I've got one person who helped me with this book. The tape transcripts are 820 pages. It would take you a couple of days to read it and sort through. And so it's a matter of level of effort and having the time. I think we make a mistake by not giving reporters patience and time and say, keep going back until you really get it. And to my embarrassment, I feel I did not realize that myself.
The second part of my question, then I'm going to go to the audience questions, is when Trump was inaugurated, did you expect to do a book this soon, or was it sort of like you saw what was going on in a way? It was like the bat signal went up and it's like, I better get on this?
Well, it depends on your perspective. From the point of view of my publisher, it was too late.
Okay.
Wanted the book sooner rather than later. And so, no, you don't know what you're going at. When Trump called me in August and said he'd regretted that we hadn't done interviews or an interview for the book and so forth, and I said it to him. I first said, I'm going to tape this, right? Yes, sir. And he said, okay.
Do you want to, just for those who might not have known, just sort of the idea that the book was finished and then you get this phone call?
Yeah, and but I said it's a pivot point in history. And I couldn't ask him a question because the book was printed, hundreds of thousands of copies. And if I asked a question and he answered it, and then the book would be out and he'd say, oh, he asked me this and that, and it's not in the book, that's not fair. So I had to really put a restraining order on myself during that 10-minute call to not ask any questions. But it is a pivot point in history. This is, people say, well, it's not normal. I don't worry about it not being normal. No president is normal. But it is, he was elected to not be normal. That shouldn't be the index. People, oh, it's not normal. He's breaking protocols. It's the way things worked in the past. This Barbara Tuchman's old order is disintegrating, being supplanted, and it needs to include some of the old order. And I think he doesn't have any patience for that.
So I'm going to turn to some of the questions. First one is about your view of Trump's intentionality as it relates to our Constitution. Does your research suggest that he fully understands our constitutional system, specifically in relation to separation of powers?
Is that a question or a
Well, you can deliver the punchline.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not the way he thinks. He might roll out the term, the Constitution, every now and then, but that's not the... What is the way he thinks? The way he thinks is he has ideas. They ask him, I have meetings, where do you get those ideas? Oh, I had them for 30 years. And if you disagree with me, you're wrong. And so there is something immovable about him on some of these really important foreign policy and economic issues. This is a serious audience, serious people, and are entitled to not a sugar-coated version of what this is. What this is there could be things that happen that are crises that should have been avoided because of this way of doing business. And it is, look, Mattis, I quote the White House Chief of Staff saying, he won't listen to anyone. He won't listen to anyone. And then I demonstrate scene after scene when he won't listen. He doesn't, it is, so.
And I'll get back to the next one, but do you worry that there's going to be fewer and fewer Mattises there, so that, in the end, if it's this way now, we could be a year from now where there's just loyalists and yes people there?
But all these fuses that are lit, one of them can go off, and there's no way to look at it. Look, there are many questions, and the good relevant questions about how do you compare this to Watergate?
This is the next question, so go for it.
Well, I looked over your shoulder on that.
You have good eyes.
Okay, no, and how is it? How does it relate to Watergate? And you've got to ask the question, what was Watergate? And Watergate was a massive criminal effort led by the president to subvert the process of nominating and electing presidents. And Nixon launched wars on the media and on the anti-war movement, on the system of justice, in the end on history. But okay, so Watergate was big, illegal. Why Watergate? And that's a complex question, but the best answer I heard was from Senator Ervin, who headed the Senate Watergate Committee, and he said, why Watergate? Because it was a lust for political power. I don't know whether there's criminality or the massive effort that went on, that relates to Trump, but if you're looking for a description of what drives him, I think it is the lust for political power. By his own acknowledgement, he is a man who understands lust. He is a man who understands power. The title of the book comes Fear, from him telling me and a young reporter at the Post, real power is, I don't like to use the word, real power is fear. So he understands political power. And the lust for political power is dangerous. And I think so that end of Watergate, why Watergate, relates to Trump, I think, quite well.
Next one is, the historian Michael Beschloss said last night that the firing of Sessions raises the possibility we could be entering territory, quote, 10 times worse than Nixon, unquote, with respect to the Mueller investigation. Do you agree?
Michael Beschloss is a terrific historian and a friend of mine, but the key word there is could.
Right.
Well, yes, it could. And, Martians could land tomorrow. And it could be 10 times, well, Michael, could it be 11 or 12? I mean, that's the kind of inflammatory speculation that I do not know what it means. I mean, it definitely could be a crisis, Mueller investigation. I think Trump knows enough to not make Nixon's miscalculations. If he gets rid of Mueller, that's it. The office is gone, and he's not going to turn over any more evidence. So could happen, would happen.
This is relevant to the students in the audience. The question is, what were you like as a young reporter, and what advice do you have to young journalists?
Oh, wow. I get asked this question occasionally, and I say to young journalists or people in any business or profession that if you're supposed to work 8 hours and you work 2 hours more, so make it 10 hours, you're working 25% more, I think you will increase your usefulness to the institution or the people you're working for, and your usefulness to yourself by 50%. I think if you're supposed to work 8 hours and you work 12, 50% more, you will actually double your usefulness to the institution and yourself. It is so much about time against the problem. And that kind of sounds, well, of course, that's obvious, but I think we haven't drummed it into ourselves enough. And because how do you spend those 2 hours, 4 hours extra? You go down avenues that maybe you wouldn't see in the 8 hours. You ask questions that you wouldn't see. You have intellectual engagement in what you're trying to do. And so that's my basic thought on that.
How do you get people to open up to you so much that the CIA director said he wishes he had recruited you?
Yeah, and the CIA director, former Gates, said, well, I get people to spill their guts about things that they shouldn't be talking about. But see, that's the problem with the CIA and the CIA director. They think when reporters learn things about how we run the government and what's going on, and if it's uncomfortable for the CIA, somebody's spilling their guts. My view is somebody's telling what they should always tell. And you've got to win trust of people. I say this, suppose let's promote you. Okay. Let's say you're the Assistant Secretary of Defense. I'm coming to interview you. What are you thinking?
Well, if I think you're going to help further my agenda, I'm looking forward to it. If not, I'm extremely defensive.
So what do you think I'm coming to you to do?
That you probably know a lot and you're trying to expand your knowledge?
Yes, and I'm trying to build a relationship, and I am going to, if you wrote an article 30 years ago for Foreign Affairs, I'm going to get it. I'm not just Googling you, and I'm going to read it and say, on page 36, you said the following, and you might think I thought only my mother read that article. And it's not a ruse. I want to know how you think. And then I'm going to treat you as seriously as you treat yourself. People in Washington, I think people everywhere take themselves seriously. And so that's a process, and I'll come back. I'll try to get into your home. I'll try to say, are there documents in the attic? And get you to share them with me. But that takes a lot. It takes time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to veer for a second, but it just made me wonder about what's your overall take in like the Edward Snowdens, the idea that there are other means that people are taking to get information out that aren't going through reporters like you, who are also going to vet it through other
Snowden, who was
reporting.
the NSA analyst, did go through the Washington Post.
Yes, yes, ultimately.
He did.
Yeah.
And they won a Pulitzer Prize for it.
Right.
So you missed that, I guess.
No, I got that, but certainly WikiLeaks.
Yes, I mean, there are other avenues of delivering information.
Right.
That's fine. See, I think the question is after Nixon resigned, and Katharine Graham, the owner, publisher, CEO of the Washington Post, wrote Carl Bernstein and myself a private letter and said, you guys did some of the stories, and before you start thinking too highly of yourselves, I want to give you some advice. And she said, the advice is beware the demon pomposity. That's really wonderful advice. Tone it down. The pomposity doesn't work, except maybe in the Trump White House. But it doesn't work in the news business. And we've got to find a way to, as I say, take a Valium gargle and kind of, not stick to the reporting, and there's too much attack of Trump or on MSNBC, CNN, too much love of Trump on Fox News, and you need to find some way to, these are the facts, facts are important, and I think they win the day if we find a way to stick to them and dig into what really happened at 5:15 on Tuesday, July 18th in the White House Chief of Staff's office.
And to be fair to the president, I should ask, what has he done well and right?
Well, he won an incredible political victory. He can be nice in that phone call to me. He didn't attack me. He said, you've always been fair to me. In the book, he asks lots of smart questions about North Korea, Afghanistan. Like on Afghanistan, that war started in 2001. It's been going on for 17 years, and Trump dared to ask the question, what are we doing? Why are we there? And the general said, no, well, we'll change the strategy a little bit. It's just a few thousand troops. But I know and report in the book, he still wants to get out of Afghanistan. He might be right about that. So it's not one-dimensional. Hugh Hewitt, who is a conservative radio talk host, I was on his show and he talked about the book, and he said this is really an important, astute book, and he said he's going to buy copies and airdrop them into every embassy in Washington, which I encouraged him to do that, and apparently he hasn't.
Will there ever be a public reprimand of the president when he publicly chastises a reporter?
Well, I think the president has a right to publicly chastise a reporter. I don't worry about that at all. And I think I've done this for 47 years. I've never once gone to a White House briefing because I knew I was not going to learn anything. I never once went to a White House presidential press conference. You have to work from the outside in, and so for everyone to get so exercised about what Trump says about the press. I mean, I don't like it, I don't agree, but the only way, Ben Bradley, the editor of the Post, said, the key always is nose down, ass up, moving slowly forward. And I think that's good advice, and particularly the part about ass in the air and moving slowly.
And I guess Marty Barron's line now is, we're not at war, we're at work.
Yeah, he's the editor
Right.
of the Post now. Yes.
The enemy of the people label and the fact that you talk to reporters. When I last visited the Washington Post, the security was much tighter than it had ever been before. Reporters out there say there is something in the air that is ominous. What's your feeling on that?
Yeah, I don't like it, but again, the answer is not to kind of open your emotions on television or in press briefings. It is to, I mean, suppose all of this energy were directed at what's really happened. Why did Trump get us out of the Iran deal? What's the Iran policy? What's the CIA doing? What's the Pentagon doing? There's the endless reporting opportunities, and it's hard. It's much easier to go to the press briefing and stand up and yell at the president. Mm-hmm. And I can understand the drive, and I don't fault reporters for getting wound up, but I don't know whether it leads to the big answers of the big questions of the policy persistence.
What, I guess this is a companion, essentially, what do you think has enabled Trump to so effectively question and undermine the media?
Well, some of it is we've taken the bait, and he's a master at this. I mean, you know, look, it runs in his blood or in his genes and so forth. But, you know, again, can I just
Please.
tell a somewhat long story about the lesson of being wrong? It's so easy to be wrong and miss things. And I want to go way back to, it was September 1974, and Nixon had resigned in August, so Gerald Ford was president, been president for 30 days. And Ford went on national television on a Sunday morning and announced he was giving Nixon a full pardon for Watergate. And it was surprising, particularly to me. I was asleep, and Carl Bernstein called me up, and truly then and still has the ability to say what occurred in the fewest words with the most drama. And he said, "Have you heard?" I said, "I hadn't heard a thing. I'm asleep." He said, "The son of a bitch pardoned the son of a bitch." And I was proud of myself because I figured out what had happened. And I remember thinking at the time, it's perfect. It's the final corruption of Watergate. Nixon, behind all of this, 40 people eventually going to jail. He gets a pardon. Ford gets the presidency. There was an aroma of a deal. And if you look at the histories, 2 years later in '76, Ford ran against Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter said, "I'll never lie to you." Ford's part of the corrupted Nixon administration, and that's why Ford lost. Carter became president. And it was pretty much embedded in history and certainly in my head. And I never did the reporting on what really happened until 25 years later. I undertook one of my book projects, a book called Shadow, about the legacy of Watergate. in the presidencies of Ford through Bill Clinton. And I called Ford up, never met him, never interviewed him, and said, I'd like to talk to you about the pardon, figuring he'd say, I'm sorry, I've got a golf tournament. I can't do that. But no, Ford said, sure, I'd be happy to talk to you. Turned out to be the most honest, open, public official I think I've ever dealt with. And I had this luxury of time. But 25 years later, what really happened? Got all the contemporaneous coverage, interviewed everyone who was alive, interviewed Ford 6 times, kept going back with new questions, new information, had all the legal memos, and kept chipping away what really happened. And it was the last interview he had a home in Colorado. His main home was in Rancho Mirage, California. Go out there for the last one, tape recorders going. And I said, okay, why did you pardon Nixon? And he laughed, and he said, you keep asking the same question. And I said, yes, I do, because I believe that you have not answered it. And then he said, astonished me, he said, you're right. I haven't. I've not told this story to anyone, including Betty, his wife. He said, here's what happened. And I have to take you to becoming president. And that was in August. And he said, I never wanted to be president. I wanted to be Speaker of the House. And I was president in August '74, and every question was about Nixon and Watergate. What's going to happen? Where is this leading? And he said then, a week before Nixon resigned, Al Haig, Nixon's chief of staff, came to see me and said, if you pardon Nixon, he'll resign, you get the presidency. And I'm sitting there and I'm saying, holy shit, there was a deal. And I said, so you made a deal? And he said, no, I rejected that deal. I knew I was going to become president anyway. Nixon was finished. I was being offered a deal of something, you give me $1 million and I'll give you that bottle of water. Well, you can have it anyway. And the way he looked at it, and I think properly, Nixon was finished. And I said, but, you did pardon Nixon. Why? And he said, now this is the question. And then this is why our business is great to be in at certain moments. Because he said, let me take you to what was going through my head. It's all about Nixon. I had this offer from Haig, which I'd rejected, but the economy was in trouble. The Cold War was still going on. I had a letter from the Watergate prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, saying that Nixon was going to be investigated because of the quality of evidence, criminal evidence against him. He would be indicted, tried, likely go to jail. So he said we'd have 2 more years of Watergate. And he said in this plaintive voice, I'll never forget, I needed my own presidency. The country needed a new president, not a rehash of Nixon and Watergate. So I preempted and pardoned him. That was the only way to get out of the ditch we were in. And so I wrote in the book that instead of this being corrupt, it was quite gutsy. Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of John F. Kennedy, called me up and said she and her uncle Teddy Kennedy read this in the book and agreed. And she said, we're giving the Profiles in Courage Award that we give each year at the Kennedy Library. We're giving it to Gerald Ford, not as a Lifetime Achievement Award or for being a politician or for being president, but for the single act of pardoning Nixon in the national interest, not his own political interest. And of course, her father's book, the late John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, was about 8 senators who self-sabotaged their own political career for the national interest. They gave that award to Ford. I did not go, but I watched it. And there was Gerald Ford, somewhat vindicated, Teddy Kennedy getting up and saying, you know, at the time of the pardon in '74, I thought it was almost a criminal act, but I was wrong. This was truly an act of courage in the national interest. And I'm watching that, and what a cold shower, because I would have staked my life in 1974 that this was corrupt. Then you look at it anew 25 years later through a neutral lens and do the reporting, and what was, I was sure was corruption, turns out to be the precise opposite. Courage, how humbling, how humiliating to be so wrong. Now, you cannot have that experience as a reporter and not think, you know, we're sure of some things now, or we're absolutely confident, and it may turn out that they're wrong. And so when I undertook the Trump book, it was to do the reporting now, not 25 years from now, and go back and say, this is the governing crisis, this is the nervous breakdown that I didn't tell you about at the time. And so you get into, it builds your stamina for doing the reporting, and at the same time, withholding judgment when you have not done the work, when you have not sat for the 820 pages of transcript with somebody who was there, who has notes and documents, and cross-checked it. And so you are in a state of what's true, what's real, what's verified, and what does it mean? And we just don't know unless we do the reporting.
Well, I can't think of a better way to bring this evening to an end. I just want to thank you so much for your generosity.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.